Hello survivors and welcome to Survivor's Guilt, the only channel that determines your odds of surviving 1980s franchise-fueling camp slasher flick Friday the 13th. So stay tuned till the end for your survival stats. I'm your sharp-dressed slasher turned sexy camp counselor, GhostFake. And before we begin, go ahead and hit that like button like it was off having sex instead of watching your son drown. And take a machete to that subscribe button like it was a snake that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And go ahead and hit that share button to let everyone know that this camp has a death curse! Now I hope you like a good whodunit where the who is impossible to guess, because this movie is getting spoiled. Friday the 13th, written by Victor Miller and directed by Sean S. Cunningham, and starring Adrienne King, Kevin Bacon, Jeannine Taylor, Robbi Morgan, Harry Crosby, Laurie Bartram, Mark Nelson, Walt Gorney, and Betsy Palmer. Friday the 13th is about a gaggle of Camp Crystal Lake counselors who start getting picked off before the camp even opens. We open up to Camp Crystal Lake, 1958, and a bunch of camp counselors getting their hormones in a boil singing campfire songs. Before these two counselors sneak off to mate, but unbeknownst to them, someone else is sneaking to off them. Checkmate. Once caught, Barry, instead of playing in her guts, gets stabbed in the gut and lands in at deposit number 1 into the meat bank. And when Claudette can't find a way around the killer, she finds her way into the meat bank at deposit number 2. Cut to Friday the 13th, present day 1979, where we meet Annie, an aspiring camp counselor who is trying to find her way to Camp Crystal Lake, but is barking up the wrong tree.
You speak English? How far is it to Camp Crystal Lake?
Until she enters a nearby diner to ask the locals that are a little more her breed.
Excuse me, how far is Camp Crystal Lake from here?
They tell her that she is about 20 miles away, but that they are shocked that they're even attempting to open the camp again, and Enos reluctantly agrees to drive her to the crossroads since he'll be heading that way anyway. But once outside, they get accosted by Crazy Ralph.
You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you? God damn it, Ralph, get out of here.
Who lets Annie know
It's got a death curse.
Enos brushes him off as a harbinger of doom,
He's a real prophet of doom, ain't he?
calling him crazy before later breaking it to Annie that Ralph is right, and that everything he said was true. Enos then begins telling her about the totally legit death curse that this camp has, including our meat bank deposits 1 and 2, but also mentions deposit number 3, where a boy definitely drowned back in 1957.
Boy drowning in 57?
Not to mention a whole host of other issues that kept the camp from opening in the following years, telling her to quit now before she ends up dead, before dropping her off at the crossroads when she won't. We cut over to Jack, Marcy, and Ned, who are heading to the camp to help get the site ready for their big opening. Cut over to the camp where we meet Steve Christie, who has been dropping loads of money trying to get this camp open. When Jack, Marcy, and Ned roll up and get to work helping him, we then get introduced to Alice, who has been assisting Steve prepare the camp for opening. Steve gives them directives before driving into town to pick up supplies.
You neglected to mention that downtown they call this place Camp Blood.
Cut back over to Annie, who is hitchhiking her way to Camp Blood, back when hitchhiking was safe and effective, and she gets picked up by a mystery person driving a Jeep, the least trustworthy of all potential rides. The Jeep speeds off down the road, eventually speeding past the road to Camp Crystal Lake, before the music clues Annie in that something's not right.
I think we better stop.
Annie jumps out of the vehicle, injuring herself, and the Jeep doubles back to put her out of her misery. Annie runs deeper into the woods before running directly into the killer and running into the meat bank at deposit number 4. Cut over to the camp where the counselors are pulling pranks and killing snakes, when an officer, Officer Dorf, shows up looking for Crazy Ralph.
Looking for somebody. Guy named Ralph. Town crazy.
Before the chief calls him back into town. But later, while Alice is working in the kitchen, she gets jump scared by Crazy Ralph, who was hiding in the pantry.
You're doomed if you stay here.
Who warns them that God sent him to warn them before he flees the camp himself. Later that night, Jack and Marcy sneak off to have premarital intercourse, and Ned follows a mysterious figure into one of the cabins. I bet that person drives a Jeep. As the storm picks up outside, Brenda, Bill, and Alice decide to pass the time playing Strip Monopoly, which sounds like torture. Cut back to Jack and Marcy, who were having sex underneath meat bank deposit number 5, aka Ned, who had his throat slit shortly after following the mystery person into the cabin. And later, when they've wrapped it up, Marcy leaves to go to the bathroom and Jack stays behind to bask. But when he lights up a smoke, the killer shoves an arrow through his throat, shoving Jack into the meat bank at deposit number 6. Smoking kills. Cut over to Marcy, who is being stalked in the ladies' room, when she hears something while washing her hands. She goes to investigate, believing it to be her friends pulling a prank, but she finds nothing but an axe to her face, and her way into the meat bank at deposit number 7. Cut back over to the most boring game of strip anything ever played, and the storm reminds Brenda that the windows of her cabin are open, so they'll have to finish the game some other time. Ugh, they'd rather die. Cut over to the diner in town where Steve wraps up his meal and himself, before heading back to the camp, but on the way his Jeep dies, but he lucks out when Sergeant Tierney happens upon him and offers to drive him to the camp. Cut back to Brenda, who is ready for bed when she hears someone cry, "Help me!" the oldest trick in the book, and she follows the cry all the way to the archery range, where someone turns on the lights before turning hers off in an on-screen, off-screen deposit into the meat bank at deposit number 8. Bill and Alice leave the cabin to investigate the scream and head to Brenda's cabin, but instead of finding Brenda, they find a bloody axe in her bed. They attempt to call someone, but find that the phone lines have been cut. Hello? Before attempting to leave in Ned's truck, only to find that the truck lines have been cut also. Cut over to Sergeant Tierney, who drops Steve off within walking distance of the camp. When he gets approached by someone with a flashlight, he greets them before they greet him with a knife, depositing him into the meat bank at deposit number 9. Back at the camp, someone turns out the lights when they shut down the generator, so Bill offers to investigate while Alice goes to sleep.
You want me to come with you?
Why don't you stay here and try and get some sleep?
Sometime later, Alice wakes up and decides to go make some coffee before deciding to go look for Bill. She heads to the generator room but can't find him until she closes the door and finds his body hanging on it, fixed to the meat bank with arrows at deposit number 10. She runs back to the cabin and barricades herself inside. She stops for a minute to come up with a plan for escape, but then gets surprised when someone chucks Brenda's dead body through the window. Alice sees someone pull up outside and runs out to greet them, believing them to be her ticket out of here, only to find that it's...
Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees.
Who?
An old friend of the Christies.
Oh, alright. Alice runs into her arms for comfort, and Mrs. Voorhees says that she's just being hysterical, and that she is not afraid of a couple dead bodies. Mrs. Voorhees goes inside the cabin to see what all the tears are about before she goes off on the history of the camp, suggesting that Steve never should have tried to open it in the first place.
Did you know that a young boy drowned?
Explaining that the camp has been cursed with sorrow ever since a young boy drowned while the counselors were off making love instead of watching him.
His name was Jason.
And that she was the cook at the camp when it happened. Alice begins having second thoughts about the sanity of Mrs. Voorhees when she begins talking to Jason through flashbacks.
Jason was my son, and today is his birthday.
Mrs. Voorhees mentions that Jason was an only child.
My only child.
And good thing too, because he's got a face that not even a mother could love. I mean, when you play the lottery and you lose that hard, you're not going to have more than one. Mid-thought, Pam starts losing it, blaming Alice for her dead son, so Alice uses a fire poker to knock her down. Alice then flees the scene, but gets cut off by dead bodies at every turn she makes. She runs off into the night with Pam Voorhees hot on her trail.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
They play a game of cat and mouse across the camp before Alice, after having gained the upper hand, arrives at the lakeside to wait for rescue. But when Mrs. Voorhees attempts to sneak attack her with her machete, Alice fights back and eventually wields the machete herself, and uses it to decapitate Pam Voorhees, sending her straight into the meat bank at deposit number 11. Before she commandeers a canoe and sets out to the middle of the lake. The next morning, she wakes up on the lake to find that help has arrived, in the form of a mentally decomposed little 32-year-old boy who doesn't look a day over 11, who launches from the lake and pulls Alice into it. But just then, she wakes up in the hospital, having hallucinated that horrible scenario that would have opened the door to numerous sequels of varying quality.
Is he dead too?
Who?
The boy, Jason.
The doctors assure her that it was just a dream, but Alice is certain that there is a dead boy in that lake, and the movie ends. So now, to find out, what are your chances of suffering survivor's guilt? This is where we take a look at our main characters and the death that surrounds them to determine your odds of surviving this movie. We start off our meat bank deposits with Barry and Claudette getting nailed into the meat bank at deposits 1 and 2, followed by the tale of Jason's death landing Jason in at deposit number 3, Annie hitchhikes in at deposit number 4, followed by Ned bunking in at deposit number 5. We then get Jack, 2-pump chumping in at deposit number 6, followed by Marcy axing in at deposit number 7. Brenda drops in at deposit number 8, while Steve greets in at deposit number 9. Bill generates deposit number 10, and we wrap up our meat bank deposits with Pam Voorhees, losing the head she lost at deposit number 11, into our meat bank. Now let's take a look at our survivors. We've got Alice and Crazy Ralph, which means that out of a total of 13 characters, only 2 survive, giving you a 15.4% chance of surviving this movie. Given those odds, how would Pam make sure that you didn't survive further into the franchise? Let me know in the comments below. And if this is your first time on my channel, go ahead and subscribe so that you don't miss out on any of my future videos. And come back next time to see how your odds have changed once we cut into Friday the 13th Part 2. Alrighty guys, thanks, and don't die.
It's got a death curse.